Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, cis and transgender, straight and queer, human and alien, bodied and disembodied. Welcome to the Integral Stage. I'm here with Bruce and Rick Repetti, and we're going to be continuing a sequence of discussions we've been having around an integrative, post-metaphysical, or maturing meta-modern philosophical take on the dynamics of meditation. And like we teased last time, today we're going to go into some of our personal contemplative experiences. There are our daily interesting experiences. There are our frequent but not inevitable experiences. And then there are the fantastical occasional experiences that stand out by virtue of their contrast to the norm, and which, at least for myself, we keep around as signposts of our journey and as possible sources of ongoing inquiry into what successful principles might be. So I think we're interested in all three and how they stand relative to the methodologies of meditation. I want this to be sharing and bonding. I want it to be a presencing of evidence from contemplative practice. I'm also aware of the risk of self-congratulatory indulgence that attends to recounting tales of ourselves. I'm also aware myself of a kind of embarrassment feeling, like, sure, that happened, but after all of that, is this still what I am? But I don't want any of those hesitancies to hold us back. I want us to feel very free in sharing. And maybe we'll just have a few opening remarks before we get into some experiences. Do you have any framing feelings, Bruce?
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this. I was thinking that this was partly what we were going to get into in the last conversation, and so I'm glad we did make some time for it. I think we probably all have an ongoing interest in this subject matter because of personal impacts and shifts over many years. And I definitely share your caution about maybe going too far into the indulgence and self-congratulation and comparing scars of that kind of thing that we can get into. But also, my hope is that, what happens, what might stand out for each of us as extraordinary in our lives are in some sense extraordinary. And at the other side of it, they're ordinary, and that they actually are things that we should probably try to normalize as being available to anyone who really, really deeply wants to take up these types of inquiries and self-work. I think there's some natural skepticism about how important experiences are to overall spiritual growth. I definitely feel like they've played some role, and that I also feel like some aspects of my own growth have been behind the scenes or in things that I can't quite articulate, or I can at least draw the straight lines between that experience and where I am now. So I feel that they are markers along the way. I don't know if I can give them absolute causal power in my life, but they've been important. And I think they are interesting to share about, as indicators of what's possible in our own perceptual worlds, in our own self-world modeling, in our own potentials for growth and change. So that's what I'm looking forward to, really. I'd like to talk a little bit about kinds of practices that we've picked up along the way and what some really notable experiences are. I really like what you said about some of the ordinary ones and some of the standout ones.
How about you, Rick? Anything you would say by way of opening orienting remarks?
Yeah, well, both of you didn't leave much for me to say because you covered an awful lot of all the kinds of relevant considerations that are kind of hovering around in my mind about today. So I completely second and third. Second what Bruce said and third what Layman said. Is that the way you say it? I third that? Did I just make that up? But one of the things that you said, Layman, that I wanted to maybe riff on a little bit was, I don't remember where I picked this up along the way. It might have been my first spiritual community. One of the teachers in there, I'm just don't remember exactly where, but I know I've come across this thinking more than once that in certain kind of maybe esoteric spiritual communities that you shouldn't be sharing these experiences, the exceptional ones. You're supposed to keep those to yourself. And then I remember also that advice being I think it was Sri Ramakrishna who made this metaphor about when a sapling is small, you put a fence around it, and that's what satsang, a sangha is, and you don't tell people about your experiences who are not on, members of the cult, so to speak, because they're going to destroy your faith in what they'll, rip it apart, or all these various different things about speaking the Tao, so to speak. And then, of course, what's his name? Lao Tzu, spoken Tao is not the real Tao. So, and then, so there's all that. And then there's this thing about, sharing like ghost stories and everything, even, I think David Hume even said in his criticism of miracles that one of the motivations that kind of might debunk the validity of miracle stories is that people like to sit around the campfire telling ghost stories. They get attention from it. So there's some kind of ego thing in there. So I'm aware of all of that, but I think it's important. I think it's more important, well, as long as you're aware of that and you try to make sure that you're modulating that and not falling in the wrong direction, for people to hear about these things. For other people who've had the experiences, and for other people who haven't had the experiences, because many people who have had kind of bizarro world, mystical experiences, the culture around them often mirrors back to them that they're insane, or that they're schizophrenic, or they had a psychotic break, and sometimes maybe they did. But so like we need to have a lot more dialogue about all this so that we have a greater understanding of it. So that's why I think this is important, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'll just say one other thing. There's a fellow named D. Osto. I don't know if you've come across his name. He's written a few books about Shaivism and whatnot, and he's doing a book right now about Buddhism and the paranormal. And he interviewed me last year. I forget what he saw something that I wrote somewhere in one of my prefaces to one of my books, that what started me off on this path was some, like out of body experiences and this and that. And it was a book about Buddhism and free will or something. So he contacted me and asked me if he could interview me. And he wanted to hear all those spooky stories. He wanted to hear about all the paranormal things that happen to a serious meditator. That's what his whole book is about. He's just interviewing a whole bunch of people. And so I already had the experience of telling him all these kinds of, mystical / supernatural seeming, paranormal-ish, whatever. But, the meditative experiences are only part of that, or that's only part of, maybe meditative experiences and those kind of phenomena that happen to you when you are a serious meditator fall under a larger category of what your life is like when you're a serious meditator. So I don't know if those things are going to come up today, but I listened to the tapes that he recorded of us in preparation for today, because I my memory for these things is like flaky. So hopefully, but that's just some of it. It's that this is more about what practices and which ones do you think had which effects on your life. Right, and there's room for, because those things also were effects in your life based on your practices. But okay, that's my preface.
Mention the memory thing, because there is a weird thing where you go, oh yeah, I did see Kali that one time, but it might completely slip your mind.
No, really, and there was a period of my life where my spiritual discipline practices and all that was so intense that I was having these experiences all the time, and that was more the norm. And what I remember telling D. Osto at one point was, look, D, if you could you really tell me all the things that happened to you between ages 15 and 19? No, you have some episodic memories about a high school dance or some bully or what, various different things that were salient. Well, during that period of my life, that was my most intense sadhana, and being in altered states was the norm for me at that time. So all I kind of remember were the things that were kind of really weird or stood out or whatever. So I'll just throw that out there right now. As far as memory goes, yeah, Kali, a good example.
Well, I'll tell a story, hopefully not too long, that I think brings up two elements of how I continue to think about meditation and contemplative practice. So then we can maybe just circle around telling stories. This was in my early 20s, maybe 2021, something like that. I had been one afternoon observing that I was constantly wincing, like mildly contracted at all times. Every moment was a moment of at least mild contraction. And it seemed to me I was taking on the form of a question in each moment. Then I wasn't quite articulating the question to myself. Like if it was too warm and I was like, I'm like, how am I going to handle this intensity of heat is what I was asking myself, but I wasn't quite asking it. So I thought, well, maybe my psyche consists entirely of questions, and that maybe I can move them from subconscious to conscious by actually articulating them. And in that moment, I will step momentarily beyond them. So I sat down, and for a couple hours, I tried to turn every implicit question into an explicit question. And it did sort of create a lot of coherent background space to the point where nothing seemed to be arising. So when nothing was arising, I got up and I went outside for a walk, and it seemed like I wasn't really walking. It seemed like something was animating. I didn't have to do any of the work, even to hold myself up. And then I started to feel like maybe I was God. It started to feel like whatever I mean by God, that's what is doing this right now. And I just wandered around completely dazed and delighted and a little bit peculiar. I noticed there weren't statues of me all over the world. That seemed strange. I wandered down to the gazebo and I sat there just blissed out. And then I thought, well, maybe I should write this down, because what good's a revelation if it's not recorded for people? And this girl came biking down the street on a very low bike, seemingly moving too slow to even stay upright. And it was just so fascinating that after she had gone by, I was myself again. And I thought of all the, it was the goddess, it was distraction, it was all these things. I chastised myself a little bit for returning. And of course, the very next day, you try the same practice again. You want to get that amazing result. And it didn't work, and it didn't work the next day, and it didn't work the day after that. It produced interesting effects, but never that same explosive transformation experience. And I started to think about it as what I called the 1-millionth customer. Every day you go down to the store. One day you go in, boom, fireworks, lights, you get a free ham. It's fantastic. If you go tomorrow, you will not get the same effect. It's not caused by the thing you just did. It's caused by all those people going to that store all those times. So the two things I wanted to bring up are, one, meditationalization. Like, you can turn an insight into a practice and test out the insight by turning it into an inquiry. And the other one is, there's not necessarily a straightforward one-to-one connection between the practice you were just doing and the result you had. It could come from practices you were doing days ago or years ago, or all kinds of other variables. So that skepticism has been in the mix for me ever since.
What a wonderful story. Very insightful, too. I completely agree with this preface about healthy skepticism, about linear cause and effect attributions, especially when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I think in a previous conversation or two, I think it was you who mentioned, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and Osho were having a debate, because he was the no method, and the other guy is the mantra guy. And finally, the mantra guy told him, you don't need a method because you had a method for so long, right? So, but when you're in a certain place, that method was way back there. It had something to do with it, but it might not have been linear. But yeah, it's so hard to make these careful, why? Because our lives are a mess, and we try, people like us who are on a kind of path, who are experimenting with all sorts of things. We're each one of us, never mind in the store, the millionth customer, it's the millionth thing that we've done. I think even in Hesse's Siddhartha novel, the Siddhartha character says about the Buddha, like, he's teaching that this is the way to get there. Those things probably were signposts along his path, but maybe even those weren't the things that led him to his enlightenment. even if they were, does that mean that they're going to apply to me? I'm paraphrasing it, but that idea was in there, and I remember thinking that makes an awful lot of sense, and that's pretty much what you just said. Just adding to it, it resonates with me a lot, and that's why coming on, when either or both of you were saying something about we want to talk about which methods led to which results, I was getting nervous thinking, I'm not so sure I know which methods led to which results. So now I feel much more at ease. I'm not seeing people on slow-moving bicycles ease, but I feel relaxed. Thank you, Layman.
Yeah, I'd like to share with us, Bruce.
Yeah, I really like that opening story too, and I wasn't quite sure where to begin, so it put me in mind of maybe sharing some very early experiences also. One thing I was just thinking of as Rick was talking was famous thing that Ken Wilber sometimes says, which I think he took from Alan Watts or maybe somebody else, but that Satori experiences or meditation, Satori experiences or enlightenment is an accident, and meditation is what makes you accident prone. It doesn't cause it just makes you prone, right? And so I think that's good thing to keep in mind. And for me, I'm thinking of two relatively early experiences where I was aware somewhat of spiritual literature and spiritual possibilities, but did not have any practice yet, and I was just looking in these directions. It was late teens probably, and two things happened. One, just out of the blue, it was kind of like what Layman had said, though you had said you'd had a practice beforehand, but I had just gone to watch a movie, and at my Christian college campus where I was, and then I could walk, through the downtown back to my dormitory, and I walked out of the theater, and it was night, and there were these brilliant stars above, and there were just a few scattering streetlights around, and the leaves were beginning to turn with fall. And something happened where the whole scene began to move as this enormous, unfolding, unified process or circle of which I was a part. And I could feel every star like flickering in and out of existence with like a really intense, with an intense fire of becoming and exhaustion. And I could feel my body becoming and being exhausted. And I just felt like this entangled in life-death process. It was a comedy I had just watched. So I didn't really feel like I was watching anything profound, but coming out of that space and into maybe just the sudden shock of just this enormous universe with a vast sky, something shifted. And so that gave me an early sense that other states of mind are available to us, and in those states of mind there can be significant phenomenal logical differences and insights. And for me it was a profound kind of existential writing on that moment of me feeling myself participating in the death process, which was the creation process. And it was just very visceral. And then one other experience, that time I also didn't have a practice yet, but I was reading a lot of David Bohm at that time, and I got inspired to try to create my own language along the lines that he was suggesting, and was trying to make a process and perspective-based language that did not reify things into things. And so it was a big effort for me to create a grammar that did not do that did not divide the world up in that way. And so I found I didn't only have to think about grammatical structures and syntax and things like that, but I had to constantly pay attention to the way that my mind was parsing phenomena and delivering me a world that showed up in a particular way. So it involved me in this kind of ongoing inquiry. And I remember at one point where I hadn't solved the problem grammatically yet of how to switch over entirely to like a process-oriented system that didn't, thingify or nounify. But I suddenly found myself just experiencing the world in a radically open, process-oriented way where there were no, singular identities, but everything was just this dance of relationship and becoming. So it was a very opened up sense of being in a much more fluid world. It's like if you had a painting that had dried, and then suddenly it had become liquid again, and all of the the colors were moving and dynamic, and you could feel the field in a very different way. So again, that gave me a sense that deliberate, sustained inquiry again can shift deeply our self-world ordering and even the way that the world appears. But at the time, I didn't have a disciplined practice yet.
That painting behind you kind of reminds me of what you were just talking about. Can you press a button on the control and make those things start to move? Beautiful descriptions. Your description of things being liquid and not objecty, and when you came out of the theater, this kind of opening, closing, moving, whatever. That was a really excellent description. I've had a hard time trying to figure out how to verbalize that kind of experience, which for quite a while in the middle of the peak, I don't know how many months or years or whatever of my practice, almost every day was kind of like that, in that kind of space. And that it also seemed to warp time, and like the girl on the bicycle, and there was a kind of almost like a deja vu, instantaneously precognitive sensing of what was coming and going in this kind of conveyor belt kind of relationship with everything around me. So the languaging that you just used kind of reminded me of that, and that I've had a difficult time trying to, explain that, because it was kind of like a norm for me for quite a while. And that's so different. Layman in the opening remarks was talking about the ordinary, the extraordinary, and how the extraordinary is ordinary, and like what is the standard against which something is normal, like I said to my friend D. Osto, for those years of my life, like, can you remember those 4 or 5 years of your teenage life, right? That was the norm for me for a while, for quite a while. But I know, I can't say how I know, but I just instinctively know that was, I was accident prone because I was practicing to be accident prone. And then I had almost like a continuous, accident for a long period of time, with many accidental in and out. It was up and down, these phenomena, and altered states and everything. And like there's almost a way in which the unique stories that I can pluck out from episodic memory are more like the dried paint pictures, compared to the way that it was so fluid and kind of just radically different way of experiencing being in the world. And there's no doubt in my mind that my meditative practices made me, prone or ripe for that sort of. I was ripe already though, because, and this makes me think about, I was talking to Dee about it in the tape, that was like several months ago, but I just heard it yesterday to remind myself of some of these things for today. My first experience was an accident, like you coming out of the movie theater. I don't remember reading anything about this sort of thing, and I had an out-of-body experience, which really was an accident. I stumbled upon a yoga class on TV, and during the deep relaxation period, I had an out-of-body experience. And that's what led me to go out and try to learn about yoga and meditation. That completely, the insight from that was that my model of reality was off. There's something else going on. I need to find out about it. I threw myself into it. But when I retroactively think, how is that possible? I had to already be ripe, but there were no real things that I can attribute in this lifetime that made me ripe. It makes me wonder about reincarnation or rebirth or whatever you want to call it. That's a freaky topic. It's one thing for us to talk about all these experiences. It's another thing to talk about things like karma and reincarnation. I don't know, but that's a deeper topic.
interested in a kind of ambiguity between the extraordinary experiences for which we must be ripe or accident prone, and the kinds of experiences that are, in fact, pretty reliable in our experience. So when I do my morning meditation, I usually use something like what I would call a subtle mantra, a repeated point of focus that's meant to be gentler and gentler than the amount of tension that my mind is automatically orienting toward in each moment, until it starts to spontaneously hold in the subtle, depressurized, balanced feeling. And then sometimes if I have extra time, I then hold that as the meditation, and it goes up to another level, or I just get up. But this sense of a balanced, thoughtless, smoothly flowing form of mind where the world looks extremely interesting and you're not just bedeviled by all of your concerns. For a lot of people, that's got to be an extremely extraordinary state that they might not even believe in. But I think anybody with a regular practice life can find those spots with a pretty high degree of regularity. So it's not quite an accident in that sense. And I'd also mention maybe a different kind of experience where if I do a practice that pulls all of my different systems and parts, or at least several of them together, so that I feel really solidly more than my parts, very often I inspect that just as a feeling quality. But if I look up and behind the eyes, there's a kind of hypnagogic imagery that's associated with that particular feeling quality when I attain it through a small number of different practices. And I think of it as beholding Bhagawan. Like I see various protean shifting apex characters in an imaginal sense, gods and goddesses and a throne, sometimes with no entity, and sometimes a sort of cellular geometric thing that suggests to me that it is really what all those apex things are being projected onto, at quite visible, quite visual, and with a pretty high degree of regularity. So I'm intrigued by what we think we can often access, in addition to what strikes us as accidents we are ripe for.
Well, I'll just say that description, or most of it, or very much like it, applies to a lot of my meditations in my years ago in my earlier practice that involved this kind of visual space. And is it real? Is it Kali? Is it this? Is it that? And it seemed like to me back then that these phenomena were real, and that I could access this kind of space in certain kinds of meditative, calming, opening thing. I very rarely have this kind of visual experience in my recent few years of practice, because different kinds of effort, different. I don't attend to this mode looking for that anymore. That's just not in But there was quite a period in my meditative practice where that was almost like regular for me, and also almost like a doorway into more expansive versions of that I would kind of go into.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because there's a difference between whether experiences are happening and whether we're interested in or attending to them. Bruce, would you like to regale us with another micro tale?
Yeah, I was reflecting on different things that I could bring in. One of the things that I noticed is in thinking about, maybe subtle experiential shifts, it's interesting what gets highlighted and what doesn't, and if certain things carry meaning or not. And I remember being in some intensive vipassana, retreats in monasteries in Malaysia and other places, and sometimes some very prominent, sustained, days-long patterns of energy circulation and different kinds of visuals or energy feelings would persist over a long period of time and seem to be correlated with different things. But in my experience, the teachers there were not at all interested in those things or what they might involve. And I think there was wisdom in that it didn't lead to what they were really aiming that practice at. It's what, in a way, opened me up more towards something like Tibetan Buddhism later, when I was first resistant to it, thinking it was too ornate and involved and too many things going on with it. But later I found such a capaciousness within it that it was really able to work with all of those kinds of phenomena and to recognize that all of them contributed in different ways and all of them could be distractions in different ways. But there wasn't as much, as I felt within the experience, a kind of channeled boundary kind of thing where we're only looking at this and put that outside and just drop it. Even Zen will do that sometimes. Just, okay, you have the different Makyo rising and then just drop it, right? But yeah, within Tibetan Buddhism, it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes you can have too many things and try to track too many things at the same time, and you can get lost in that. But I found, at least within the capacity of that vehicle, a way of engaging with all of these different dimensions of human being and really recognizing that all of them can be folded in to overall transformative experiential practice. So I really liked that kind of openness there. In terms of like just the ordinary shifts in I remember especially, an intensive period of practice when I was in college and regularly, doing some Tibetan sadhana. Involved some shine, some concentration practice, and some visualization practice, and some other kinds of things. But that sense that you described of this kind of like smooth, almost like a smooth spread out bliss, and which made all phenomena stand out with ultra clarity, and at the same time, I felt most ordinary physiological phenomena were tinged with intense pleasure or bliss, and that if you moved into any of them with any degree of focus, they could almost move in the direction of like overwhelming orgasmic bliss. And so it was a fascinating state to be in, for a long period of time. But it also eventually, and this is one reason why I think it's valuable for us to do this kind of sharing. In some of my classes on transpersonal psychology, one of the things we talked about is the line between spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency. It's a thin line of not having basically any narrative field in which to place the arising experience, and therefore resisting it, blocking it, panicking about it, all kinds of things where it actually can become problematic or disturbing. And for me, that was beginning to happen in college when I was having these sustained experiences of that kind of spread out, bliss-tinged daily experience, in that I really became disturbed. Is this actually normal, or is something going wrong in me? And I went to the doctor and talked about it and said, I want to make sure that nothing physiologically is wrong with me. I'm not complaining about the experience, but I want to make sure nothing is off. So they gave me a checkup, and then they just laughed and they said, we want what you got, don't worry about whatever you're experiencing. We want what you got. Just enjoy yourself. And they sent me out the door. But I had to go there because even though I had a teacher, he was at a far remove from me. And in my field where I was in circle of friends, nobody really was there for me to talk to make sense of, or to normalize any of that kind of experience.
That social piece is so interesting because, of course, there's the risk they point to of getting obsessed with experiences and clinging and craving and deviating from a particular developmental trajectory. But there's a sense in which to A, form community, and B, assimilate our own experience, we do need to find ways to share it with each other. And it might not be share it with everybody. There is some kind of membrane. But those things are in a very interesting creative tension with each other. Rick will tell us some really amazing events.
Well, I've had so many. I could, let's see what comes to mind. Well, I've had an awful lot of, I don't know if I've mentioned this in our discussions before, I've had an awful lot of, I attribute them to meditation, but precognitive experiences and paranormal type phenomena happen to me. Let's see, one of them was, my first meditation teacher was a woman named Hilda. All my friends knew that I was into meditation and yoga in high school, like carrying Ram Dass's book Be Here Now around, and it was like a Bible in my hippie knapsack. And one of my friends said, friend of a friend said, so-and-so, Patty, our friend, she was a friend of my girlfriend's, she goes to this meditation place in Greenwich Village. There's a woman who's been in India for like 20 years or whatever. And I was like, there, the next day, I gotta go. That was, I had that out of body experience. I started reading about yoga and Zen and whatnot, teaching myself. It was within a matter of months that I found out that there was this woman. So I went there and I connected with her and with those people. The feeling was overwhelming of connection, meeting them. But just fast forward about 6 months no, maybe more than that, around 6 months of going there once a week, Thursdays, where she would give a talk and lead a meditation and whatnot. And she'd occasionally have like a guest, some Swami who she knew from India was in town, and he'd come and talk or whatever. So this is a little bit of a long story, but she had a woman come in, a woman named Joya, long black hair, a Westerner, who she didn't say much about Joya, but she let Joya give a little talk and lead the meditation. She said that she was a spiritual friend or whatever. I forget how she introduced her. And I felt a tremendous connection with that woman. But then there was no talk about her. I never heard about her again. And maybe a few months later, I had this dream where I got in a Volkswagen with my best friend at the time, Barry, who had started going to Hilda's, and 2 or 3 other people who I recognized from Hilda's, but I didn't know them personally. And we went to this part of Brooklyn I had never been to. I'd only been living in Brooklyn for like 2 years, and it's huge. I had never been on that side of Brooklyn, just my high school and local shops or whatever. And but we drove into this area I didn't recognize, but I saw the street signs that kept going up, East 20s, East 30s, 40s. I had never gone beyond like maybe East 20-something Street, Flatbush Avenue. And it was all the way up into the East 70s. We passed this IHOP, International House of Pancakes, in the dream. And then we went to this street corner and stopped. And when I got out of the car, I looked at the street sign, the 2 signs, Avenue L and East 72 Street. And I had a deja vu in the dream. Like, I knew this. This was meaningful. I stopped and I took it in and I was like, I know this. And then we went like a couple of doors off the corner, up this brick stoop. There was a wooden carved door. We went inside. We went in a spiral wrought iron stairway down into the basement, where it was a meditation room. There were like 20 some odd yogis in lotus poses. And this woman, Joya, was sitting on a pedestal with all these yogi pictures behind her and candles and incense. It was like an altar around her. And she led this meditation. I went through the meditation in the dream. And when it was over, this woman who I recognized there were a few people there I recognized from Hilda's, but I didn't know them either, who got up and came over to me as people were saying goodbye and hugging and all that, which would happen at these kind of spiritual meetings. She comes over to me, green eyes and blonde hair. I remember her face. I don't know her. I never asked her name. But in the dream, she said, "Oh, how did you like it?" I said, "It was awesome." And it really was a very deep and powerful and moving meditation in my dream. So this is kind of multiply metacognitively weird. Deja vu, meditation, and dream. I tell my friend Barry about it because he was in the dream the next day. His eyes are popping out of his head. And I'm just like, what? He says, I can't tell you. Go tell Patty, the girl who brought us to Hilda's. I said, why Patty? He says, just trust me. Just go tell her. I go tell her the story. Her eyes are popping out of her head. She said, just, is somebody put you up to this? I said, put me up to what? I'm just telling you the dream I had, right? So when I was done, she said, you completely described Joya's neighborhood, her street corner, her house, inside and out, and that's how the meditations go. That's what her altar looks like, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, I have to go. She said, but it's private meetings only. That's why B and Barry couldn't say anything to you, because it's in her basement. She could only fit so many people down there. Hilda's had hundreds of people in a big open church, big cathedral in Manhattan. I said, well, I think I've been invited. She said, I think so too, but I have to check with Joya. So she was kind of like in charge of who gets to go there or whatever. And I got permission to go, and it was exactly identical, except for one little detail. I mean, the ride there in the Volkswagen, the IHOP, the address, everything, the outside of the house, the inside, the basement, everything, the meditation. When it was over, that woman got up. It was dark, only candlelit down there. This woman with the blonde hair and the green eyes comes over to me and, in one sense, falsifies the precognition, but in another sense, doubly verifies it. Because instead of saying to me, how did you like it? She said, I had a dream that you were here. All right, now that's not a meditation experience directly, but things like that happen to me a lot during that period of my life. And like the only explanation I have for them is that meditation opened up the filters for that sort of thing. So
yeah, interpenetrating realities. We've just started a series on dreams, and I'm realizing, listening to you speak, that one of the questions I should be bringing up with people is, what is the significance of meditating in a dream? How is that different or the same as meditating here? The other thing that came up for me while you were speaking was this notion of, it's not necessarily connected to what you were saying, but it popped up for me, was indifference in a way, like positive and negative forms of indifference. Bruce had mentioned going to the doctor, and I had an experience one time. We went over to Salt Spring Island, this little island on the West Coast, with some people. It was several days of just esoteric and Dharma talks, but we didn't sleep. We were drinking and doing drugs. And on the way back, we sat outside on the ferry in the freezing cold. And I didn't realize at the time when we got back, but the next day I was extremely ill. But when we got back, we went out to this restaurant, and I couldn't tell what anything was. I had this, and I was trying to say it to people. I put my hand right in the really hot soup, and I'm like, I can't feel that. I don't know where the boundaries of anything are, right? And there's a little voice in the back of my head that's like, this is a great experience. You're always on about transcending boundaries. But it was very disturbing. I couldn't quite feel the disturbance at the time. But when I look back at it now, I'm like, no, that was dysfunction. That wasn't, I can compare it to other experiences I've had where I've been unable to tell the differences between things, and it's been very reliable and very wonderful and very empowering. This one was some kind of failure, probably due to the physical circumstances of my basic capacity to make distinctions with my nervous system. So keeping that in mind is interesting. And I thought of another event where I went into a very intense kind of indifference mode. In my mind, I called the bathtub samadhi, because I was having this bath and I was thinking about various situations in my life and how many of them would be resolved if there was an increase of communication on my part. And so I thought, well, this is very interesting. I did meditationalized it. So I closed my eyes. I'm like, oh, let's just go through. I'll go wherever my attention goes to any situation and see if that situation in my feeling or in reality might be corrected if I was to voluntarily enter into more intense communication. And so one situation after another went through, and it seemed really good. And it sort of built up to a place where I felt pulled up near the top of the head, a kind of sucking feeling. And then all of a sudden, it was like I was pulled out really thin. And what I said to myself was, I'm being smudged. It was like a bit of goo being smeared on a glass. I was smudged right out. And then I was gone. There was no self, no world, no time, no space. It was like nirvikalpa samadhi or something like that. And I don't know how long it went on. My body kicked. And then I was suddenly back, and I realized I could either return to that or not return to it. And I thought, I don't want to return to it right now. I'm actually concerned that being too intensely in that space might not be good, that maybe nibbling over time is better than really going there all at once. Because I felt like there was potentially a danger of being too absorbed, too intensely in an indifferent kind of ecstatic state.
Yeah, that brings up a number of things for me. One, Stan Groff, he makes a distinction between different kinds of meditative experience. I really appreciated the dream, precognitive dream that you shared. I've had a number of precognitive type experiences. I mean, yours is really detailed and so many factors. To me, it's really, that's something hard to just debunk as a coincidence. There's too many pieces there. So there is this blending of boundaries and crossing of boundaries, and that's something that Groff talks about in terms of types of meditative experiences. One, which are within the ordinary time-space reality that's familiar to us, but which blurs the boundaries or crosses boundaries or performs operations within that context that are outside the norm. So precognition or distance viewing and other kinds of things like that can happen where, yeah, you're still maintaining generally the consensus reality. There still is that address with that house and those people are going there, but you're able to access it in ways that are outside of convention. And then there are types of experience which seem to go outside of conventional time space, and like that kind of smudged out nirvikalpa void that you're talking about, or experiences in the bardo or of deity forms, of seeing Kali, or merging into that apex of visionary experience where you're experiencing things that at least are not available to ordinary physical senses. And they could be realms of shamanic journeying or things like that as well. And then there are, I think he's following Jung here, but he talks about psychoid experiences, which seem to involve some cognitive element and some physical element. That there's a shift, actually, but something like synchronicity, where there's like a collision of meanings from multiple dimensions, but they actually manifest in an interactive, encounterable physical form in some way. And it could show up in terms of, physical phenomena or synchronistic experiences or, stigmata and things like that, where there's a kind of crossing of the boundary between, apparently the physical and the deeper spiritual or imaginal. And I'm also thinking about a distinction in Tibetan tradition between dreams of clarity and dreams of clear light. And some of those questions that you were asking, Layman, maybe if I do a dream session with you, we'll get into that. But a dream of clarity in general is what Jung would call a big dream. It's an interactive experience with something that seems to be a wise presence that in some way is beyond the ordinary ego self, whether it's outside of you altogether but it's a big type of dream that is initiatory or visionary in a way that you're not lucid in the dream. You're not, in Rigpa, in the Tibetan sense, but it's a big dream, a meaningful dream that seems to be spiritually charged. And then there's the dreams of clear light, in which you actually are deeply centered in kind of like the root of consciousness, and then all of the phenomenal field of the so-called dream space is shifted. So in relationship to those distinctions, I have maybe some visionary or dreams of clarity kind of examples that I could share, but want to stop there if you have any thoughts or riffs on any of those distinctions.
Those are a lot of really good ways of parsing experiences. Nice little maps there. I would love to hear about some of your examples of some of those those things. So
yeah, give us a few.
Yeah. One of them I was thinking of because of your description of being smudged out. And I had been at the Krishnamurti school in Rajghat for about, I was living there and teaching creative writing, and then just doing a lot of practice every day. Not telling Krishnamurti that I was practicing, but I was doing a lot of I was doing my own inquiry, my own self-driven inquiry. Basically, most of my focus was on watching the movement of thought and paying attention for gaps in thought and doing a number of other things. But I remember, at the time, I had done some Vipassana, and then I had, been deep into Krishnamurti, and I really was, at that time, suspicious of formalized meditative traditions. But I'd also gotten turned on to Ramana Maharshi while I was staying there. I knew about him before, but I didn't really take up any of his practices until I was at the Krishnamurti school, and some things from Jean Klein. So I was pushing into Vedanta territories with my own kind of practice. And I remember I was sleeping, and I woke up, and it felt like I woke up. I later realized I was still dreaming, but it felt like I woke up and got out of bed, and I looked, and there was somebody standing at the far side of my cabin. My cabin was there on the corner of the Ganga and Varuna rivers, right by Kashi Vishwanath Temple and the road that Buddha walked to Sarnath. I mean, it was an ideal little place to be living. And in that cabin, I saw somebody standing, and I stood up and I approached, and the guy walked out, and it was a lama in a robe. And he was looking at me, and then suddenly he just pounced on me like a leopard and just tackled me and pinned me to the ground. And he put his knees on my arms and held me like that. And he just stared straight in my face, and he said, "It's too late. You've already swallowed it. Just let it be." And I felt what felt like a razor blade moving slowly through my veins until I could feel it going up here. And as soon as it hit my temple, I died. So he just guided me to let that happen. So then it hit my temple, and basically it was like I died. Everything just exploded. It was like an incredible whooshing sound, and then a sealing sound, like whoosh, and then just absolute voidness and silence and no phenomena. And I don't know how long that went on, but there was like a subtle spark of clarity there where I wasn't absolutely gone, but there were no things to pay attention to. But then gradually, in that blacked out space, that nirvikalpa kind of space, I began to feel the emergence of subtle phenomena. I didn't hear anything. I didn't have any outside sense of the world, but I became aware of my heart, and I could feel that. And then it expanded out to the periphery of my body, and I still didn't have any. So then it was one of those experiences of slowly coming back into the world, and the body and the senses all coming back online. And I remember, similar to you, Layman, I also kind of willed myself back into the world. I knew I could have remained there, but there was something that I felt like it was enough of a bath, and it felt like pushing the limbs through like a honeyed wall, where it was like everything was like thick with some kind of I don't know how to say it, but then once it emerged out, I could feel actually the lightness and the clarity of the ordinary being a body in an atmosphere kind of feeling. So that was one of the visionary experiences. And then another one is a big, long one that went over many days. So maybe I won't tell that one at this point, but that was one of them.
Wow. Well, I'm not sure if what I'm going to bring up is riffing on what you just said, but it's in the same kind of sort of space somehow or another. And I think it's my turn to tell a story. So let's see which one. I'll tell a couple of short ones and then one longer one. In one meditative experience that I was having regularly at one of the many kind of splinter meditation meetings that were revolving around that Sangha that I was a part of with Ram Dass and Hilda and Joya, I remember having this experience many times of kind of going into this kind of just, my consciousness would just kind of expand in every direction, but upward and outward, and I would become kind of formless, and then I would be gone for I don't know how long, and then it was as if I was descending from some elevated place where I would stop at this kind of way station on the way back, which was kind of like an astral version of like the Parthenon, one of these Greek column places, but it was like a celestial light realm, speaking of light, and in the center of it, and there were a bunch of souls. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. I knew that we were all around, almost in a circular formation around this, I don't know if it was a deity. My sense of it was that it was like a god, like Apollo or something. It was some kind of wisdom sage thing that was telepathic, and that we were just kind of drinking some kind of liquid wisdom telepathically. And it was intuitive, it was transconceptual, but it was rich, and it was just it wasn't anything I was doing. It was something that would happen. And then, when it was kind of over, I would just kind of drift back down, into this big space around the apartment where we were in Manhattan, and I would wind up just kind of eventually just kind of shrinking back into my body during the meditation. And I never told anybody. A few years ago, I told one of my friends who was in those meetings about that, and she said, that happened to me all the time too. That only happened at those meetings. And the woman there, I wasn't hearing anything once the meditation happened. There was no continued instructions. We would go into, there was some maybe initial thing, and we would go into meditate. We all would just meditate in silence for, I don't know, an hour. I don't even remember how long it was. That's one thing that happened. Two other quick things. I've had not only one false awakening, I've had double false awakenings where I woke up and got about my business, then I woke up again, and then I woke up again, and that was like the real wake up. That's freaky. I've also was killed once in a dream, and then I was like a ghost, and I followed around the people at my own funeral, and then my ghost was killed. This is just kind of, speaking of dreams, I know you're interested in dreams. These are not necessarily, whatever. I just thought I'd throw those in there because those are quick, short stories. But once Ram Dass gave a lecture in a public auditorium, and I brought my cousin, because he knew about him, but he was never really a part of this stuff. He was always interested in this stuff through me, but he never really dove in. So I brought him to see Ram Dass, and we compared notes afterwards, but at one point on the stage, Ram Dass, I couldn't see his body. He turned into a light body. It looked like one of these paintings of Padmasambhava or something with all that rainbow-colored light and everything, and it was dynamic and moving and everything. And I asked my cousin, "Do you see that?" And he said yes. And when we compared notes later, we both saw that. One more quick story. I went to Ram Dass's apartment one night. He lived near the pizzeria that I was working in as a volunteer that was connected with our Sangha. And his class cut out, and a lot of his students came to the pizzeria. It was like a whole wheat pizzeria that we had, and we had soy hot dogs and whatnot. And so they would come, and the place was connected with the Sangha because everybody was like a volunteer thing to help orphans or something. And so after all his students came over, my schedule as a volunteer prevented me from going to the Ram Dass meetings, and I was getting really pissed off about that after a while because I really felt connected with Ram Dass. So I was like, And, you know, I felt like the guy who owned the pizzeria was kind of taking advantage of me a little bit. And I just said, I got to go talk to Ram Dass about it. When I saw his students, I said, I got to go talk to Ram Dass about this. So I went over, it was like 10 o'clock at night or something. His meeting had just gotten out. I went and knocked on the door. He opened it up and he recognized me. He just invited me in. And just, this is anecdotal, but Bhagwan Das and what's his name? Allen Ginsberg were there. They all came to the door eating ice cream. And so Ram Dass just invited me in. We went into another room, we sat down. I talked to him about the pizzeria and Raja, the guy who owned the pizzeria and everything. And after we were done with that, we were sitting across from each other. And he just started doing this thing of looking me in the eyes and kind of guiding me to relax. And he just walked me through this thing where I could kind of feel each part of my body and release it. And my body was disappearing as I did it. And as that started to happen, Ram Dass started to have a glow of silvery gray halo of light around his body that was three-dimensional. It was like a whole globe of light emanating from him. And then I was starting to, as I went deeper and deeper, there was nothing but this, and I closed my eyes and still sensed this field growing, and we were both in it. And at some point, there was no more talking, and I went into that expansive thing, and at one point, I felt almost infinite, and then it was like I disappeared. There was like an emptiness, void thing that had but it was this incredibly peaceful thing, but I was absent and yet minimally present in some way. But it was very expansive. It felt almost infinite. And when it was over, I remember feeling something clustering together from every direction, but like way up over my body. But it was it was me that was reforming. And I remember coming to that place, but it was like way above, physically above me, looking down mentally and knowing that was my extremely limited version of me down there. And I remember feeling like I had a choice. And I just sensed that I wasn't done yet. And so it was almost like a liquid that poured back down into my body. And the minute that it was this tremendous condensing and shrinking feeling, but I had trust about the whole thing. Like that was like when people say they have out-of-body experience or near death and they didn't want to come back. It was kind of like that feeling. But I knew I had to come back. The minute that I felt like I was in my body, Ram Dass walked into the room from another room. Like he knew that I was back. And he said something like, "Some trip, huh?" Or something like that. Yeah, and I was like, and he gave me a mala and whatnot, and then I left. But that's just one of my. That wasn't so quick, was it? Okay, I said a couple of quick stories, but.
The Sangha and visionary experiences bring to mind a few things for me, particularly from one Buddhist community that I was a part of for a few years, and I remember there was an evening where this guy who would wear the robes, Xiao Hai, he said, "Turn your hands up if you want to be initiated." And everybody turned their hands up except for me. I thought, I don't know about this. I haven't thought this through. So anyway, it turned out of that group, I was the only one that ended up getting initiated because I went down to the class one day and I was way too early. I had a coffee, went to the bookstore, and I was still way too early, so I just went to the shop, and I walked in, he was standing there, he said, "Oh, have you come for initiation?" And I said, "I guess so." So we went upstairs, and he seemed to exude an electrical energy and chanted in a language I didn't recognize. And the next thing I remember, it was several hours later, and I was at an ice cream shop. And I thought, okay, was I overloaded because I couldn't handle that amount of energy? Was there something about the situation and the unknown nature of the words that put me into a trance state? I'm not sure, but I'm going to struggle to be awake with this guy. So over the course of a couple of years in these classes, he would give us a meditation instruction, which was very often to just attend to the function of awareness itself, to focus on focusing in some respects. And he would seem to exude a thing from himself energetically, and we would all go like we were going to sleep. And I would struggle just to have a little bit of awareness under that extra pressure. And in that in-between state, I would see things like the theta waves were projected on the external world. One time I saw what felt like my consciousness go out around the back of the room and come back through his eyes. So clearly those were my eyes. There was one time where he seemed to be the radiant source of the Dharma, and there were these kind of cat women crawling between the students trying to feed on this energy.
Wow.
There was one time where just before I ended up leaving that community, I suddenly saw myself sitting where he was sitting on a little dais, and there was radiant blue light, and all these little dwarf figures were laying on the ground like they were asphyxiated. They were my vices. And there was another frame kind of pushed in from the side, and in this frame, same seat, but now the light was golden, and all the little creatures were dancing around. And I thought, oh no, I'm going that way. I'm not going to be in this community very long. But it was very interesting because I don't think that the effects were primarily from the meditation instruction. I think they were either from his energetic output or from the meditation, like the focusing generated by the situation of having the person and having the community, and having it's like the situation itself is an intense focusing of your interest and awareness.
Yeah, before I forget, I forgot to say that when I went to Ram Dass's apartment, it was like maybe 10 o'clock at night. We only spoke for about 15 minutes or something like that. When I came out of the meditation, it was daylight already. So I was gone for at least like 8 hours or something like that. I mean, I had a number of those where I thought it was 20 minutes and it was 4 hours, But that was the longest one that I just now realized. I was there overnight.
Wow.
It's what the UFO people call missing time.
Yeah, in a meditative posture, Yeah, I was abducted.
A couple of the things, I was debating whether to tell one story or not because I shared it in another series a year or two ago on this channel. But because of some of the things that were just shared that are so resonant with it, I want to go ahead and talk about it, especially about feeling yourself in a circle of souls, in a sense, feeding on liquid wisdom, somehow there being a kind of energetic transmission from another being or beings, and it's not exactly that you're following any kind of meditation instruction, but something is shifting. So this kind of relates to all of that for me. And at this time, I was living out in the wilderness in Arizona. I didn't have a home. I was camping out in the forest land. And I was looking for work at that time, I think, but I had a lot of time to myself. And I remember one night waking up, or really it was a dream that woke me up, but the dream was that I was sitting in the tent without a shirt on, and my back was to the open flap of the tent, and a buffalo had stuck its head in the tent and breathed on my back. And I felt this powerful, warm, energetic breath just whoosh, right up my spine. And then I really woke up. And I remember just feeling from that, something big is coming. I don't know what it is, but something big is coming. And I had begun to start reading Krishnamurti's books at that time. So I was thinking about some of his teachings and things like that, and just playing music and experimenting with awareness out in the canyon lands. And the next night, I woke up from sleep, but I didn't fully wake up. I knew I became aware of the sounds outside my tent, but I couldn't move my body. I couldn't feel my body, but I could hear that there was the wind in the trees and some of the rustling outside. And a voice began to speak to me, and a voice started describing to me the nature of consciousness. And I remember laying in that state for hours, for basically the whole night, while this voice talked to me about consciousness and the nature of consciousness and the depth of consciousness and the being and the becoming of God. It was like this long, beautiful homily or sermon, on consciousness. It was an instruction or a pointing out kind of thing. And then the next night, I was sleeping, and in a dream, I felt that some beings were approaching me, and I turned, and there were some beings who were looking at me. And I remember feeling about them that these are Rilke's angels. I also felt these people are coming from Krishnamurti, but I called them Rilke's angels because there was something about their eyes that was intimidating through their intensity. I could feel that they were not bad, but that there was something terrible in the earthly knocking to terror. There was something terrible about them in the power that was coming through their eyes. And they said, "Follow us." And so I followed them out into the woods outside my tent. And there's like a gravel floor, and they had prepared this kind of bowl in the gravel, like this indentation in the gravel, and they told me stand in the center of it. And I stood in the center, and they stood in a circle around me, and they just said, "Relax, just relax." Well, I relaxed, and my body slowly began to move in Tai Chi kind of like movements, and I just was letting my body follow whatever it wanted to do instinctively. But I became self-conscious about what was happening, and I couldn't keep up with the flow. So they said, "Okay, let's try something else." They asked me to basically to arch my back, to bend over, my feet on the ground, my arms on the ground, and do this yogic stand with my stomach up to the sky. And so I did that within that thing. And then this beam of light shot from the center of the bowl up straight into the sky, and my body just slowly rose up along that and started to turn around it like an axis. And as that happened, my mind just expanded out into an incredible cosmic vision of lights and colors and sounds, and really I can't really categorize whatever I was seeing. I didn't have language for it. It was just this feeling of being immersed in this vast cosmic visionary scape that was full of power. And at some point again, I became conscious of myself, thinking, is this what they want me to do? What am I supposed to get from this? And I collapsed to the ground. And they looked at me, and one of them said, "You must learn to bear the weight of that tree." And then they departed. And then the next night, so this was 4 nights in a row, the next night, I remember waking up, and I was suspended about this high above a luminous blue wisdom ocean, consciousness ocean. The ocean was sentient, and it was luminous blue, radiant, sentient ocean. And I was just communing with it, face over the water. And that was just like infusing me with some kind of teaching. And I knew that something was coming into me in the form of an instruction, an initiation, an imprinting, but it was beyond any kind of language. So it was just something that went into me, and it was just a period of communion with that luminous water for a while. And so that was the end of that 4-night sequence, which has always been perplexing, kind of fascinating to me, a little bit perplexing, in that I wasn't in any lineage at that time, and yet it really felt like a deeply archetypal initiatory kind of encounter.
Wow, that's something. I want to go swimming in that blue ocean. Well, one quick lucid-like dream. I say lucid-like because I think I mentioned this to John Vervaeke in one of my talks with him. I've had so many lucid dreams in the ordinary sense where you know that you're dreaming, so to speak. But during that period of my life when all this kind of weird stuff was happening to me all the time, there were many times where I would, it's like a dream yoga thing, I wouldn't fall asleep when I fell asleep. It's kind of almost a contradiction, but retain a kind of continuity of consciousness as I exited the waking state and went through the hypnagogic thing and then into the this kind of, it's like a dream world, but it's imaginal or something. And that was so lucid in terms of being vivid and real and ontonormative, often more real than real. But I was conscious, but I wasn't, I realize I'm dreaming now. That's what happens in ordinary lucid dreams, So it's kind of, there's two senses of, maybe even three senses of lucid. So sometimes you have such clear dreams, even when that's a one-off thing, but that it's so powerful and meaningful and vivid and it seems more real than real. That's lucid in another sense, right? So, but I had those things happen to me so many times that it's hard to say which version of it, happened to me. But a couple of stories that fall into that category. One was one of the guys in our Sangha who was an older man from Sri Lanka who was very close friends with Hilda. He had a little meditation group once a week, and we would go there, and I became very close to him. His name was Raja, a very sweet man. And at one point, he had something wrong with him, some kind of illness, and he was in the hospital. And I remember visiting him and seeing light coming out of his eyes and a kind of halo around him. And I thought, I wonder if he's near death or something. That was just my intuitive sense. But then he got out of the hospital, and months went by, and he seemed to be on the mend. And one night I had one of these lucid or vivid or whatever you want to call it. I was very conscious in the dream, but in the dream, this pillar of sparkling rainbow-colored light came down like the teleporter in Star Trek, this beam of light. And it formed an image of Raja. And he telepathically communicated with me that he was, Maha Samadhi, he was gone. And he came to just kind of bless me, say goodbye, whatever. And that was a beautiful, loving, happy thing for him and for me. And it was totally natural to me, even in that altered state that I was in. I was like, oh, okay. I thought he might be leaving this earth, and then that was it. And then the next day, I went to Joya's meditation. She was the third of the major teachers, Hilda, Ramdas, and Joya. And when I walked in, she knew I was close with Roger. She said to me, Ricky, that's what they called me back then, Ricky, your Raja died last night. And I said, yeah, I know. Just one little short story. Another one about, this reminds me of was a kind of shaman or a lama, had his knees on your arms, holding you down. I had, after a period of my life when I had opened all those psychic floodgates, and then I realized that I need to shut them. And I did a reverse sadhana, as I call it. So all the things that I gave up, like meat eating, smoking, drinking, drugs, sex, all that, I put it all back. That's another story. But, I had a whole bunch of omens and visions that let me know I need to do that. So I did that. And then, years later, for moral reasons, I decided to become a vegan again. And, I did the meat eating thing and everything to ground me and get rid of all that psychic phenomena because I wasn't ready for it. I was only in my late teens. And in any event, I had been a vegan for a couple of years, and something organismic, I don't know if my own brain generated it or whatever, but I had this kind of vivid lucid dream where there was this I don't know, I couldn't tell the ethnicity, but it was like Mongolian, Tibetan, Native American, some kind of shaman guy in a hut, in a grass hut, had some kind of makeshift little stove with some kind of really primitive looking pot, and was making some kind of meat mixture and saying it's this, and he had some kind of weird accent, this for you, right? And and I was like, no, I don't eat meat. No, you eat the meat, right? And I don't know if it was Japanese, whatever his accent was. And like, I was like, no, I am not eating that meat. And like, he got very stern with me, and he had like an assistant with him who was a big, strong man. And at one point, the both of them wrestled me to the ground to force me to eat the meat. And I just burst out of the dream and woke up, right? I would not eat that damn meat. And then like, less than a week later, I just found myself eating meat. Now, I don't know, maybe I made it up, who knows? But that's what happened. It was kind of weird. And I took that to be something like one of those, there are some of these omen-like experiences that just strike you as, this is a message for you. And that had that quality for me. Even though I didn't want to eat meat, I was morally against it. I had been teaching my students to be vegans. I taught about animal rights in my ethics classes. And, it was like, I do not want to eat. But like, I started eating meat, and I felt a little more grounded after that, to be honest with you. So.
So much good dream sharing going on. I feel a bit self-conscious about not talking about my exciting spiritualized dream content, but I'm going to keep that up nonetheless. And I'd like to talk instead about koans. And there's a lot of different ways to approach a koan. For me, it started to fit into that category of fairly reliable experience generating practice. I was always interested in it a little bit because of the logical puzzles and the interesting stories of the Zen patriarchs in ancient China. It wasn't until I really started to read Koan and Dogen that I fell in love with those two guys. I don't really care about Zen Buddhism, but I thought these guys are reminding me of something I really want to work on. And there was a suggestion from Koan that you could fairly reliably have Satori or Kensho by using these little linguistic gymnastic tools in a certain way. And Dogen had specified in one of his writings that every piece of the koan is the whole answer. There's no like, the student's a dummy and then he gets the answer at the end of the anecdote. Every piece of the anecdote is the supreme answer. So I would sit and work with these, out of some of the old books, and I would chew on them, and I would try to think of, you come up with an answer, and it might be the answer, but it's not good enough. You come up with another one, you start to come up with all these different answers, and it's almost like you're regenerating the whole Dharma, because each one you come up with captures a different piece of wisdom. But in the midst of all of that, you keep running up against this sense that there is the complete thing you're looking for is present here, and B, you can't get your hands on it. That sense of frustration, of being right up the most meaningful limit you can go up against, and a place where, for me, sameness and difference are so together, you can't separate them, but they can't be together. And that's like an impossible vexation. And by allowing myself to be vexed with enough intensity in enough repetitions in a row, then it was like I would get completely trapped, and this explosion would happen, and the feeling would be every question is answered before it's asked, that kind of a feeling. So it's like having omniscience. You don't know anything, but you've already got the feeling of the answer before your mind can move toward a question. And that would last for a while and wear off. But it's become a thing that I can fairly reliably get to if I'm willing to put the time and effort in. It's a very interesting kind of practice because it has an inquiry aspect where you're trying to solve this puzzle, but it also has a shamtha, direct focus aspect where you're holding on that point of existential frustration. To the point where, I sometimes jokingly think of it like a clitoris or something, right? It's like you're stroking your impossibility button over and over again until there's an explosion.
Wow. What a metaphor.
I don't think I've really worked very much with koans. I did toy with them a little bit, but never turned them into a practice. But I do remember an experience where I think I'd been really wrestling with self-inquiry kind of questions in India, and I'd found a lot of really illuminating wisdom in Jean Klein's teachings, and there was a combination of kind of Kashmiri yoga, energy-based yoga, combined with Advaita type self-inquiry. And so I was working with that for a while, and I had some breakthroughs. And I remember, I think those had happened, and those had been very illuminating and also joyful. I remember just sitting in my cabin laughing out loud as some of these things clarified. And I picked up that Douglas Harding book on having no head, that little thing where is it Douglas Harding or somebody Harding, last name of Harding, but he talks about the practice of following the finger and experiencing being headless. So I picked that up right before a trip to Nepal, and I remember riding on the bus between India and Nepal, and I was reading a lot of old Japanese poetry, some haiku and some spiritual poetry. But even though that was a different tradition and a whole different world frame, I remember every single word and line just dropping luminously into this pool of understanding of like, that's what this is pointing at. And it's not something that you could really it's not like all of them were linguistically solved puzzles and that there was a definite kind of singular verbal answer for every, but there was this deep sense of knowing the place that those words sprang from and plopped back into, right? There was that feeling of just being immersed in that. So there was that kind of arrival in the going. I don't know how to put that, but that was such a beautiful experience of reading those things.
We're at 90 minutes. Are we all still good to keep going for a while?
Yeah, I'm good. I wouldn't say that it was a formal Atma Vichara, whatever, self-inquiry kind of practice, but there was a period during when I was with those teachers in that community where I was doing a lot of the reading about the different philosophies that might explain all of this, and the ways in which they contradicted each other formed kind of like an endless set of koans for me, just trying to figure out, how is this all the same? I knew it was on one level, but I didn't understand, so that I would often sit in a meditative inquiry kind of mode, trying to resolve these things in my own mind. And then, like what we said in the beginning, you make certain efforts, and then maybe something happens later on that is the fruit of those earlier efforts, but it might not be direct cause and effect. But I remember many of my meditations, and throughout the years too, this is something that I do a lot. I'll just sit there with whatever it is that I'm confused about and just try to open it up and figure it out. And it's not necessarily logically try to figure it out, although there's that aspect of it. So, but I remember that was, there was this kind of conflict and tension and almost a kind of bodily inquiry, this what just hearing that what the both of you just said reminded me of that phase. And I believe that, from, if my memory is correct, this one experience that I had came on the tail end of that quite a period of time where I was just absorbing all these different models that didn't fit. And so I had this meditation where I went into this deep altered state, and a lot of them for me were this kind of expansive, becoming not bodied, or my body, it wasn't like an out of body experience, but I just kind of would my body would just kind of fade out of my awareness would expand, it would become very subtle and calm and clear and blissful, and like I penetrated some, like through some film or something in this one experience, and I felt very expansive. There was some kind of central vantage point to my consciousness, similar to that Ram Dass thing that I talked about. But like the realm that I felt like I was in, it wasn't a blue lake, but it was functionally just like this blue lake. I was in this oceanic wisdom field where every little, and they weren't really particles, but like every little node or aspect of it was rich with mind. It was sentient, it was a mind, and it was incredibly rich with meaning. And it was like all the answers to all the koans that I was struggling with. Like it suddenly it was like a little enlightenment kind of feeling for me, and I felt omniscient. You know, I wasn't looking around for statues of myself afterwards, but you know, not that kind of omniscient, like, oh, no, but it's just like, it literally felt like, oh, I know it, I know everything now. And there was a way in which any one little space or droplet in this ocean or field that I directed my attention to would open up, and it holographically was connected with every other element of information and wisdom in this wisdom mind ocean thing. Sloppy language, but, and I remember thinking, yeah, I get it all. Like it all makes perfect sense to me now. I got it. And and I think I told you this story once before, because I remember that was the one when I came out of it that I felt like a God had told me, you need to study philosophy and linguistics and all that kind. I need an encyclopedic knowledge just to be able to, because even the Earth's encyclopedic knowledge is a drop in that ocean. So sorry if that's a story I already told, but I don't think I told it in that kind of detail last time we spoke about it. Yeah, and it was only years later, that was during my teen years when I was with Ram Dass and them. It was years later, I was in my teens then, I was like 26 when I actually went to college. I had like an 8-year hiatus between high school and college when I started reading Plato's Republic and thought that the description of Plato's forms kind of sounded like what I experienced, but not exactly. His language was also sloppy, but because the experience, that almost captured it, but not exactly, because the experience was much greater than that simplification. That's like the dry paint version of it. And to use Bruce's metaphor. And then also years later, reading about, like in Buddhism, Indra's net, holographic, every diamond facet reflects everything else, and all these other models that I've read about much later, I go, oh yeah, that was kind of like that. That was kind of like that. That was like, so there's all these other models that you find in all these other places, Plotinus and whatnot, that I just didn't know anything about back then. But the experience was really mind-blowing. Yeah.
There's a weird thing in academic philosophy where we read these things from our ancestors and we assume they are they're putting forward their opinion about the analytic description of how the world works. And it's very easy to overlook the fact they might be recounting an actual thing they saw.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what I thought when I read Plato's Republic. I thought, this guy, Socrates, I don't know if it was Plato or Socrates, because it's the character is Socrates, but they were onto something that all the rest of the philosophers since then, my teachers, poo-pooed that idea. You know, they thought, in fact, Plato's wrong about forms. It's just concepts and whatnot, and you know, some kind of mystical hooey, and they dismiss all of that stuff. I remember reading about the myth of air in Plato's Republic, which is about karma and reincarnation and like all the analytic philosophers just think, oh yeah, this is nonsense. But I remember when I read all that stuff, I thought, oh, this guy, they're onto something. It all felt experience. I know that this stuff is real. And my teacher, my Plato teacher, I took a seminar just in Plato's Republic. I had took my first intro to philosophy class. The teacher said, you need to major in philosophy. And I'm teaching I want you in the honors program because I'm teaching an honors seminar next semester just on Plato's Republic. And I want you in that class. He put me in the honors program. I took the course. And I read the book over the summer before the class was supposed to happen in the fall. And I was like, oh my God. The forms, all those myths, they all seem so real to me. But then when I took the course and everything, even he would say to me, are you really a Platonist? You really believe this stuff? And I was like, yeah. And he thought, well, you might want to keep that to yourself around here. I don't know if I told you this in a previous conversation, but one of my grad school philosophy professors told me, you have an unhealthy interest in the truth.
You might want to keep that to yourself.
Yeah, and that guy who told me that, he was like, are you really a Cartesian dualist? And I thought, at least. And that's what he told me, I have an unhealthy interest in the truth. Just because I thought dualism was at least more right than materialism. And he was like, oh boy, you better keep, don't tell anybody.
What I've got coming up for me are two additional ways of relating practice to experiences. One of them is one of the ways I think about the jhanas, the sort of levels of meditative absorption, is like a fractal where you put the output back in and then it becomes the foundation of a new process. Then you take that output and put it back in, kind of fractal algorithmic reiteration kind of thing. Because if you're focusing on something and then it really starts to work, you're like, oh, now I'm really focusing, and you can make that experience into the new object of focus, and so on and so on. So there's a way in which the experiences can become the practice. And one of the things that pops up for me on that was when I went to live in Japan for a while when I was younger. When I came back to the town I lived in, I realized the trees and streets, they all look very similar. So I was standing in this town I'd lived in for years, and I thought I might as well be in Japan. And what had happened in that moment was the contextual coordinates of what it meant to see what I was seeing changed. I might as well be in Japan. And if I was in Japan, I wouldn't recognize this street. It would look exactly like this, but I wouldn't recognize it. And in that moment, it was completely fresh to me. I saw it with clean eyes. And in that moment also, I thought, oh, maybe I can do that on purpose. Like maybe that's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be the outcome of something. Maybe I could just, if I catch the way I did that, I could now do the fresh eyes thing or do the change the background context thing. And that could be a practice.
Yeah, hack yourself.
Yeah, hack yourself. Turn outputs into inputs, turn experiences into practices. So that's one of the relationships that's on my mind. The other one is the way in which moving in and out of experiences sort of blurs the boundary between having them and not having them. So I've been actually saying this a bunch lately. I used to be really focused on what I thought of as oneness. And I had a bunch of experiences that I thought of as the experiences I really wanted. And going in and out of them, something seemed to remain after a while. There was a residue of the experience. And I started to feel like, oh, that's what I really want. I called it ARCO, accumulated residual cognition of oneness. This is what I don't want to be a Gnostic. I actually want to be a pistic. It's just that I had to have the experiences so that I know what this background thing I want is. But what I really want is beingness or faithfulness or the sense that the thing that made those experiences valuable is an ongoing part of my experience. But I could only trust it by going into the experience and coming back multiple times. I think without the experiences, I wouldn't have had that spontaneous trust.
Excellent analysis. Yeah, I know that I did that during that period of my life when I was in intense sadhana. I was riding my experiences in that kind of way. I remember that. One of the first things that I kind of hacked was from my very first practice that was successful for me was candle gazing. Because when I first started trying to meditate, I had a hard time doing it with my eyes closed, but I knew that one-pointedness in many things that I read was a basic skill that you need to master. So I did it with looking at a candle flame. But when I would get to the point where I did this thing where I became one with the candle flame, and there was some kind of psi or psychic energy that kind of was released from that. And then that I would take that and apply that to other things. And, you know, it was this, what does the ARCO stand for again? Accumulated residual
Cognition of oneness.
Of oneness. I love that. Yeah, and I love that idea. There was this endless reciprocal opening thing that I would go more into flow and have more of those experiences, and go more into flow and have more intense experiences. And it just kept, there was somehow or another, it's so hard to explain this in language, but it was almost like I had felt or intuited, like radar, some kind of radar in me, identified almost like a chord or a stream that I latched onto, and then I was taken in it. Throughout all of my experiences, I could sense this, like it's like a gyroscope in my being that could find that and always ride it through all sorts of traffic conditions of daily life in ways in which I didn't recognize. I felt like an alien in my own neighborhood, and I didn't leave and then come back. I was in the same, like, you know, because I was seeing and feeling and experiencing and operating in other ways in the same physical space that I had lived in many years. It was like beginner's mind. I didn't recognize any of it, but yet I was so much more effective in navigating it because there was a prescience and all this intuitive knowledge, and the language for it just seems sloppy, but I think you both know what I'm talking about. I think there was this arco. I love that arco. Yeah, but I felt connected with something that was organismic, or like not just organismic, but like my entire being was in tune with some larger way in which the whole thing is just flowing and opening and closing, the way that Bruce was saying the first time he came out of the movie. It was something like that, only so much more. It kept growing and growing and growing because I figured out, I don't know how, but I figured out how to keep hacking and having that residual. You have some other theory about excess energy or something. I forget what you call it. What do you call that, Layman?
The integration surplus model.
Yes. Is that what you're talking about in that model? Something like that?
Something like that. Coherent, numinous, excess, surplus coherence.
Yeah, I think that I tapped into that.
You, Bruce.
I was thinking about what you said about this could have been Japan. And that was, I remember in Texas, I had a dream of being on these stairways with lots of buffalo around me. And I remember that stuck with me. But later I was in Arizona and I was walking along a creek and I turned a corner and it just struck me as soon as I saw that vista. I thought, this looks like India. I could be in India. And I had never been to India before and I really didn't know even what it would look like. But it struck me when I saw that this would be India. And years later, after working and living in Korea and Indonesia and other places, I finally ended up in India. And of course, the first place I lived was Varanasi, and I was, all among the stairways and the buffalo. And then I met somebody in Varanasi, and he told me he had some place he wanted to show me. and he took me out, and it was a natural vista that as soon as I stood in front of it, I knew this is what I had seen in Arizona, to know that this was like India, that just like it was like feeling those points kind of collapse. So that's my riff on that one part. Around the arco, I really like that too. I think about that in terms of like Tibetan ideas of one taste. And our teacher always used to say, it's much better to dip into, the rigpa, to dip into foundational consciousness many times a day, and to just take little sips and move in and out of that, and let that moving in and out stabilize, rather than having these big, intensive, long experiences. Anyway, he said those are wonderful if you have them, but he encouraged that. And also sleep yoga is about that. When you do sleep yoga, and there's a deliberate way of entering into that state and then being pulled out. Other people pull you out. And there's that practice of being in it and out. And you're trying to hold both in awareness. So to me, that relates to what you're talking about. There is that sense of like, so you can begin to recognize like the other metaphors, like the sesame oil that pervades everything, the whole thing. And so there's that feeling of the sesame oil that pervades everything, regardless of whether it's dualistic experience or more non-dual visionary type experience or whatever. So all of that, think about the hacking part of it. I was just thinking maybe in terms of moving us towards collecting what we've done and resolution. I was thinking about different kinds of practices that we've done, and to me that hacking is one of them. Some of my Krishnamurti type inquiries have been a hacking kind of practice. So definitely a lot of the TSK, time-space knowledge tradition practices are kind of hacking practices, getting a certain kind of experience and then standing on that and deepening into the experience of time or space or knowledge as you work with those experiences. So I wrote down a little survey of the kinds of practice that I think I've done, and I don't know if y'all like to hear just the kind of things that you've dipped into that have led overall, I think, to the cultivating the ground of the kinds of experiences we've been describing. So for me, there are mindfulness in multiple forms, different forms of concentration practice, like Shine, focus on an object very intensely, visual or in the body, kind of Nundro, preparatory mental reflections to just think about, is more rumination type of meditation experience. It's preparatory kind of work. Inquiry meditations where they're either verbal inquiry or they're just perceptual. You're just watching with attention, not just to see something preordained or pre-described, but really to inquire into what's happening. Different experimental meditations where they involve taking an aspect of experience and changing it and watching what happens, or mixing things and watching what happens. Visualization and energy work kinds of practice, usually along the lines of Tantra. Heart-centered practices like metta, tonglen, and generosity. Shamanic stuff like vision quest, underworld journey, sweat lodges, psychedelic stuff. Embodied somatic stuff like Tai Chi or yoga or even prostrations. I've done all of those things. And mantra or chant. I guess the last one might be even like Lectio Divina, kind of a meditative reading. So definitely those have all been part of the palette of things that I've played with over the last, 30 years or so.
I have to remember that whole list very clearly in order to tell whether I could add a couple of things to it or not. So I'm not sure if I'll try to do that. I did kind of chuckle to myself when Rick was talking about candle gazing, because when I was a little kid, we had these old Chuck Norris movies like The Octagon, right? Chuck Norris was always fighting ninjas. And I found this book when I was really young, and it was basically, it was a really cheap paperback on how to be a ninja. So that's the quality of book we're talking about. But the first instruction was you had to be able to put out a candle with your mind power. We would have these dinners. My mother would set up the candles, and I would just be like ignoring the conversation, trying to put the candle out with my mind. It never went out, but as a result, I stared into candle flames a lot and saw a lot of fascinating hypnagogic imagery, which led me on the one hand in the direction of wanting to be able to go into those kind of free-form trance states where you have interesting unfolding active imagination adventures. And on the other hand, I'm really interested in imagery as a focal point of concentration and meditation. And that was exacerbated when I got a little older and I read some of Salvador Dali's writings because I loved his paintings. And he talked a lot about this thing he called the paranoid critical experience, which was a deliberate state of mind he would put himself into so he could see shapes make other forms. He was looking for forms that would simultaneously be two different shapes, and then he wanted to be able to paint those. And it reminded me of how binaural beats work. When they put a tone through this ear and a tone through this ear, your brain splits the difference. And what it's really focusing on is the interference pattern between the two tones. And that balances the hemispheres. And this sense that two very similar images or two very similar close phenomenon could provide a hemisphere balancing focal point fascinated me. I used to start a movie on my laptop and I'd open another window. I'd start the same movie offset by 1 second and try to watch them equally on the screen so that I was really focusing on whatever they had in common. There's something about very similar image overlays, and you see that when you watch candles or clouds, because you see what it is. You see the fire, you see the cloud, but you also see the image, and they're the same shape, and yet they're a little bit different, and it draws you into a kind of non-duality because they are both the same thing and different things at the same time.
I love that. It reminds me of some practices I used to do around Castaneda's work. And one of the things,
the same thing.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things we used to do out in the desert was to take a star and you split it with your eyes until it's 2 stars. And then you just hold both stars in awareness. And then a lot of different kind of visual stuff and subtle, energy stuff usually would kind of happen as you sustain that. He has multiple things like that in his teachings. There's, where you would sit there and you would receive 2 sets of teachings at the same time in either ear, and different things like that. So they're deliberately activating that kind of wholeness making software probably in your being.
Yeah, I don't remember a lot of the details about the Castaneda work, but I remember really resonating with everything I ever read in there, and that a lot of it was like already bubbling up in my practice. I got some ideas from it, and I remember that they worked, all sorts of, like when I was describing catching hold of a cord or a beam of light, this luminous beings and fibers and all that, all those things that he described, I was like, oh, I was already experiencing those. This is real, even though some people thought it was fiction. I thought, they accuse him of making it up or whatever. Like, well, even, what is it, the book, The Celestine Prophecy is called fiction on the back. But a lot of those things that happen in there, I've had those experiences. So fiction,
Right.
But this thing about, I love the idea of 1 second apart films. What that made me think of is when I think we were talking about what's the metaphysics of how is precognition possible. I think I might have made this reference with you, but maybe it was with someone else, where, the pigeon walks like this, its head, right? But just like when Sony Walkmans, they come out with like 5 tracks because when they first came out, the CD would bounce and one would go, but they would smooth over by having 5 tracks, right? So the pigeon's world isn't coming at it like this, even though it's smoothing over the difference, like between the 2 films that are a second apart. There's something in its cognition, but so if you can sort of separate that, you're like opening the doors of perception in some way. This is what I think we're doing when we play around with those things. And I did that without reading an instruction to do it about like the 2 different teachings or anything. I just discovered that by playing around with candle gazing. That was my first serious practice. I did that for some months as my primary practice when I first got into yoga and meditation. And it did, all those things happen to me because of that. And I also felt that I managed to grab hold of whatever that muscle was, which was this laser focus that could penetrate into something and kind of separate out the aspects of it and then fuse with it psychically. And then there would be a surplus energy. There would be something that I could then apply to anything else and have these Castaneda-like experiences. It just opened up the whole world for me. That root skill is what kept opening, and I forget what you called it, Arco. It just kept opening up all those different dimensions of almost all my other practices were some kind of fruit of that original opening just from candle gazing. And I remember reading about how that would work, I think in the Yoga Sutras and in Light on Yoga, the Iyengar, that big book with all the yoga pose pictures in it, because I taught myself that before I found any teachers, but it was working before I found any teachers. And I think it might have helped me throughout the whole thing. But then there was, points in my practice over the years where I kind of it was kind of like the Osho thing versus, the Beatles guru, I always forget, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, right? Or because of reading like Krishnamurti and this and that I resonated, and that I found myself having these experiences all the time without making any effort. And over the course of my years, I've had years where this was my technique, like mindfulness of breath or body sweep or this or that or metta. I always would have a few years where that was my practice, and then it would reach a certain level of fruition, and it would just morph by itself, where I just would find myself doing a different practice, what felt natural or organismic in me. So that's why in the beginning was I don't know how I could attribute so many this caused that, because it's been like this for me, and it just keeps circling back around itself. And for the last few years, it's just been this kind of Dzogchen kind of choiceless awareness, kind of weird blend of a bunch of things like Krishnamurti and Dzogchen and this and that. But whenever I sit down to meditate now, I just let whatever meditative thing is going to happen. I don't try to do anything anymore. So I don't know where that's going to go, but
I like Bruce's attempt to sum up a lot of the types of practices.
Yeah, that was nice.
One of the other things that could be summed up are some of the open questions we keep coming back to in the tales of our experience. So, what Rick presences a lot of is this difference between what you're taught and what you hear about and what you've already discovered and find yourself doing anyway. Right. And so what does that mean? That a lot of the people who adapt well to a practice are people who are already doing something like that practice before they even ever heard about it. That's a really interesting open query. Another one is how are experiences related to practices? If there's some connection, but it's clearly not a one-to-one, you do this and then this happens, like flicking a light switch. What are the other factors in our lives that contribute to the experiences that seem like the outcomes of practice that aren't necessarily the practice? It's all kinds of subconscious emotional things, or you don't know how much your diet's playing or how much cycles of your life are operative in these things. And then also this question of particular practices and the diversity of methodologies versus the underlying skills that many practices have in common. One of the most intriguing things to me is how many different techniques there are and how many of the same results accrue to people who are practicing all these different techniques. So do they all converge to one place, or are they actually practicing some kind of proto skills underneath the techniques that have these accumulating effects, no matter what the technique itself looks like? And is there a possibility to make a short list of those things?
Yeah, I think that in a previous conversation, I think it was you, Layman, but it might have been Bruce or both or all of us. It came up, this idea that the more you exercise any kind of meta awareness, there's that skill is part of a larger ability that can manifest in any which other way. So like almost any one way of experiencing or intentionally practicing or cultivating one particular kind of meta awareness opens you up to the possibility of an infinite number of kinds of meta awareness, and your agency each time is growing, because your agency might have been at a non-meta level, let's just say first order level agency, but then when you've got this meta cognitive or meta volitional or meta sensory, whatever it is, there's so many different modalities that we exist in that can be conscious or voluntary. And so when you exercise any one of them, your kind of meta-causal, as I called that in my dissertation, your meta-causal functional abilities grow. So I think that in meditation of almost any kind is that. So I think I'm amplifying what you just suggested. And I think that's a real thing. That's just my instinct over the course of my life, and everything that I see that seems to be true. And that was kind of like the main idea in my dissertation, that like any kind of metacognitive cultivation spreads and carries over and increases your agency, while simultaneously, I've mentioned this in the Buddhist context, if you're on a contemplative path, your sense of self becomes much more amorphous, even though the skills that could make you a superego, if you're on a spiritual contemplative path, you're trying to kind of not become a big ego. It's like anti-Nietzschean kind of, you don't want to have this, will to power thing. You want to kind of grow without growing your ego. So it's ironic that as your agency quadruples, your sense of an egoic self, if this is your intention. I'm sure some people get into spirituality so they can grow their egos and, get psychic powers, become a guru or whatever, and abuse these abilities. And some people do that because we're human. But yeah.
The other day I had a.
Sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, you want to say something first?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that I assume we're near the end, and I just wanted to express some appreciation for the richness of experience and intelligence that's here, and that the theory of how these things work seems to be creeping back into the discussion. We mentioned at the beginning, just before we started recording, that it's interesting that we spoke theory and now we're presenting the evidence. So we might want to come back and revisit our theories based on the evidence that we've shared. But otherwise, just what a pleasure to be with you guys, and maybe whatever you want to do to lead us out of here, Bruce, or sum us up.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think something leaning in that direction, thinking about a couple things. One, Amy Mindell, she has a book called Meta Skills, but she noticed in doing a lot of different kinds of psychotherapeutic practice and watching all different styles manifested, that there were a lot of commonalities across psychotherapeutic schools based on the kind of skills that were being deployed that did not fall under the umbrellas of the different schools themselves. So there were more in common between, some Rogerian and Gestalt therapists based on certain skills they were deploying than, so anyway, that's how so I think we can begin to get into that territory, is begin to map what are some of the meta skills that are manifested among these different practice lineages and styles. And again, we're not going to get, I don't think, any kind of one-to-one painting of where each one leads, but I think we can see how they tweak us in different ways. And I agree with what Rick is pointing out, that a lot of what meditation is doing is exercising the meta muscle, right? And one thing I was just going to mention anecdotally was a couple of days ago, I had meeting privately with a cognitive scientist who reached out to me and wanted to chat, and we haven't recorded it yet, but anything together yet, we might. But it was a really delightful conversation, and he's very much into the cognitive science of spiritual experience and dreams. He actually just received $6 million to study those things. But one of the things that's really interesting is that he was excited by some of the dialogues that we're doing here in terms of this kind of inquiry with Rick, or what we're doing with John. and a really deep conviction that it's important in a way, I think, to talk about this whole field of spiritual practice as something that's really legitimate, and that it needs normalization and legitimation within the academy, within the broader culture, and maybe approaching it in a way that is not shy of the wildness out there, that we have to hide what happens, but at the same time is really aligned with the cognitive, scientific, and general scientific spirit of doing really refined, serious, thoughtful, heartful inquiry into all of this. That's all I want to say.
Well, the last thing I think I'll say is what came to mind is if we do this kind of research, or that fellow does with that money that he got, this is just the beginning. A lot of people, I think, people like John Vervaeke, who's a respectable cognitive scientist, and Chris Leatherby is the philosopher doing the philosophy of psychedelics and the philosophy of meditation is my work. So it's bubbling up, and a lot of people who are in that space, who are academics or scholars or whatever, I think many of them have had some of our experiences, so that because of their perspectival and participatory and procedural knowledge, they think, yeah, although the propositional mind frame for the longest time said that stuff is all hooey, it's being brought into the realm of respectable research, and that's a fantastic, wonderful thing. I think that this conversation was great. I think talking about the hooey sounding parts of it all is interesting from a kind of philosophical point of view. I'm of two minds because I've got that analytic training in philosophy. So even whenever I kind of feel comfortable being honest about my experiences, there's that analytic philosopher in my mind who says, that's all crazy, Rick. Are you really schizophrenic or something? What's the matter with you? You really think that happened to you? But like what our phenomenological experiences were and what they mean metaphysically are two different things, right? So this stuff needs to be really explored. But I think it's all a very fruitful avenue of research. So the last thing I wanted to say was that, so when all this research starts really being done and gaining traction, then Hume's argument against miracles, which is that, take Occam's razor and error theory. So somebody has one of these weird experiences, and you could just say, St. Paul on the road to Damascus, he fell off of his horse, and Jesus was yelling at him, why are you persecuting me, right? And they say, it was in the desert, he had a frontal lobe lesion. That's what Occam's razor would say. And error theory, right? You didn't see Jesus, you had a seizure, right? That's an error theory, right? And Occam's razor, take error theory and the supernatural explanation. The error theory, the lesion, is the natural theory. Occam's razor has to favor that, right? So that's Hume's argument against miracles. Occam's razor plus error theory means there are never any supernatural or miraculous. It's never rational to believe in them, right? And so science, since Hume, the champion of evidentialism and empiricism, has rejected anything like this, right? And so it's always like, this one individual crazy person said they had this experience, and then there's all of science that says miracles never happen. Occam's razor, error theory, no contest, right? Eliminate. So it's like divide and conquer each numinous experience and reject it. Well, once these things are really studied and, then the Hume argument is not going to work. Now, the three of us don't need to wait for that to happen to continue to explore and experience and kind of integrate this stuff into who we are. But lots of other people, I'm hoping that the fruits of that research will come out not too far into the future, because lots of other people who would like to and hope that they could have a more meaningful spiritual life are kind of still stuck in that mindset that Hume and Descartes and all these other people have kind of influenced the Western mindset to the way it is. So that's another reason why this is important for us to violate the rule about you shouldn't talk about your experiences,
There's a kind of reciprocal action that's really promising to me, which is, on the one hand, people who are very rational, very scrupulous researchers, beginning to open to recording and analyzing and thinking about the mechanisms that correlate to these kinds of experiences. But also the thing at the same time that we've been doing here today, which is people who've undergone practice and also had a variety of experiences, sometimes spontaneous seeming, sometimes as a result of their practice, need to be able to say those things in a way that is sensible, right? In a way that's open to being critiqued, in a way to go, well, here's what it seemed like. Here's the phenomenological data. I'm not totally bought into any one of the interpretations, right? That if you can become more credible introducers of this information into the discussion, then it gains a lot of credibility going forward as a subject of research.
Yeah, one more thing, just riffing on that. For that reason, it kind of bothers me when lots of people in this space who are, selling a brand or whatever, speak with a kind of premature authority about the metaphysical interpretations because they're kind of like salesmen or something, they're trying to say, they give people false hope or whatever, like, this is real, this is that, and there's this whole great model, and this, and they're like, it's like a sales pitch to me. And it's like, but that's not credible to scientifically oriented thinking people. So that narrative is just making the whole thing look silly for all the rest of us who are not silly.
Right, like there's this idea sometimes that if you don't really sell it, then you're not helping people to have that experience because you're not offering it to them as a reality. But in my experience, and I think in all of our experience, doubt and epistemic humility don't put any limitation on your ability to do these things and to be changed by them. That it's okay to pass through that anxiety and say, I don't know, I'm open to finding out, but this is what seemed like it happened.
Yeah.
Well said. Beautifully said. Amen. Aho.
All right. This was great. Thank you. Always a pleasure, man.
Yeah, thank you.